The revolving doors of the Sterling Heights Bank whispered open with a soft hiss as William Langston stepped into the grand marble-floored lobby. Dressed in a custom navy blue suit with polished Oxfords and a leather portfolio in hand. His quiet confidence and poised demeanor exuded professionalism. But from the moment he approached the front desk, something in the air shifted. The young receptionist offered a mechanical smile as he politely stated he had a 1 p.m. appointment with the bank manager, Susan Mallory, to discuss opening a new account for his expanding consulting firm. She nodded, tapped a few keys, and told him to take a seat, saying that Susan would be right with him. The clock read 12:55 p.m. William thanked her and sat patiently near the entrance, directly beneath a chandelier that glimmered with corporate ambition. He didn't mind waiting a few minutes. After all, he was early. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. People came and went, some with scheduled appointments, others clearly walk-ins, but one by one they were called forward. William's name remained unspoken. His posture remained upright, polite, composed. Every now and then, he glanced at his watch but didn't complain. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the subtle sneers that drifted his way, especially from behind the frosted glass of Susan's office, where her silhouette moved about as she entertained another client. Finally, after nearly an hour, she emerged. Blonde bob neat, heels clicking with purpose. Susan looked around and saw William. Her gaze paused for a moment too long before quickly sliding away as though he were a misplaced chair or a maintenance worker on break. Instead of greeting him, Susan leaned over the receptionist's desk and whispered something. They both glanced toward William, then chuckled softly, their faces adopting the kind of neutral professionalism that tried, and failed, to mask hidden biases. William stood to approach, thinking perhaps it was finally his turn. But Susan turned on her heel and disappeared again into her office, this time holding a cappuccino and leading another man inside. A man who had arrived 15 minutes ago. William returned to his seat. His phone vibrated, and he glanced down to see a text from his assistant. "Good luck with the bank meeting today. Let me know how it goes." He smiled faintly and typed back, "Still waiting." By 2 p.m., William had been waiting for over an hour. The same receptionist avoided eye contact. Staff moved around him with quiet efficiency, but it was clear to him, and now to a few observant clients, that something was wrong. A man in a hoodie who had entered after him had already opened a checking account and left. A couple interested in a mortgage loan were ushered in with apologies and bottled water. The irony wasn't lost on William. He was here with 7 figures in assets ready to be deposited, seeking to open accounts that would tie his company to the bank for years, but his skin color, quiet demeanor, and refusal to cause a scene had rendered him invisible. Finally, at 2:15 p.m., Susan exited her office again and called out, "Yes, Mr. Langston?" She said his name like it was a question she wasn't convinced of. William stood up once more, his back straight and expression composed. "Yes," he replied, extending his hand. Susan didn't take it. Instead, she tilted her head, arms folded. "You said you wanted to open a business account?" she asked flatly. William nodded. "That's right. I scheduled this appointment last week. I also emailed over all documentation ahead of time." Susan gave a tight smile. "Right. Well, let's see what you've got," she said, waving him into her office with the dismissive tone one might reserve for a solicitor rather than a client. The office was tastefully decorated, with leather chairs and a large framed certificate of recognition on the wall behind Susan's desk. William took a seat as she settled behind her computer. She didn't offer him water. She didn't ask how his day was going. Instead, she squinted at the screen. "Consulting firm, huh?" she muttered. "We get a lot of those." William patiently explained his business model, his clientele, his projected deposits, and his reason for choosing Sterling Heights Bank. Susan barely looked up. "And you're the sole owner?" she asked skeptically. William handed her the incorporation documents. "Yes, all under my name." Susan flipped through the papers quickly, then dropped them on the desk. "I'll have to verify these, and it might take a while," she said, without offering an explanation. William simply nodded. "That's fine. I'll wait." She rose and walked out of the room without another word. William sat alone, the office door left ajar. Outside, Susan leaned into a colleague's cubicle, speaking in hushed tones, her voice punctuated by quiet scoffs. The colleague peered inside and gave William a once-over before returning to her screen. The wordless judgments filled the air, thicker than the scent of coffee and lemon-scented polish. William had spent years building his company, consulting for Fortune 500 firms, and speaking at global summits. But none of that seemed to matter here. Not to Susan. Not in this room where assumptions preceded facts and prejudice wore a polite smile. Despite the humiliation, William did not flinch. He knew that dignity wasn't a gift granted by others. It was a choice, a quiet force held firmly within. He stayed seated, eyes calm, legs uncrossed, hands folded neatly on his lap. The walls around him were lined with awards Sterling Heights Bank had won for community engagement and diversity in finance. The irony made him want to laugh. But he didn't. Instead, he waited. The minutes continued their quiet march toward invisibility as William remained seated in the lobby, the afternoon sun casting long beams through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. He had returned to the lobby after Susan told him she needed a few more minutes to process his paperwork, though he knew now it was just another brush-off cloaked in professional pretense. The waiting area around him shifted like a revolving door. New customers walked in, others completed transactions. Conversations buzzed and faded, and still, he sat there, untouched by the momentum. A little girl waiting with her mother kept glancing at him, her youthful curiosity unfiltered, while the mother looked away, avoiding his gaze as if acknowledging him would be an invitation to discomfort. William simply offered a warm smile and returned to reading from his tablet, scrolling through quarterly projections and internal performance metrics from his team, refusing to let resentment creep into his posture. Behind the frosted glass doors of the manager's office, Susan entertained another client, laughing audibly at one point, her voice momentarily lifting above the soft murmur of the bank's atmosphere. Her colleagues occasionally looked over at William and whispered among themselves, but no one approached him. Two younger associates walked by with coffee cups in hand, throwing him half-curious, half-dismissive looks, perhaps wondering if he was in the wrong place or waiting for someone more important. William checked his phone again. It was nearly 3 p.m. He had now been in the bank for over 2 hours. He considered leaving, but something inside him refused to surrender to the treatment, not out of stubbornness, but from the quiet assurance that the test was not his to fail. A man in a construction uniform entered and approached the teller window. He was greeted warmly and assisted within minutes. A couple followed, asking about loan options, and were promptly offered bottled water and seated. William, still in full view of the staff, was offered neither. The lobby had grown more populated, and yet in that crowd, he seemed to be the only one frozen in place, a quiet fixture that no one wanted to acknowledge. The receptionist, now busy tapping at her keyboard and laughing with a coworker, never once looked back to check on him, even as several customers came and went. William shifted slightly, stretching his back, then stood to walk toward a water dispenser tucked near the corner. As he filled a paper cup, he caught a reflection of himself in the glass partition. Still as sharply dressed, still dignified, but undeniably weary. He returned to his seat and took a slow sip. Though he exuded calm on the outside, his mind wrestled with a growing frustration. This wasn't the first time he had faced subtle discrimination wrapped in professional civility, but it never got easier. In boardrooms, conferences, and negotiations, he had learned how to navigate these spaces. Spaces not always designed for men who looked like him, with grace. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. The challenge was always to remain unshaken in the face of it, to resist the urge to storm out or raise his voice, knowing full well that any outburst would be weaponized as validation of bias. And so he waited, not for Susan's sake, but because he wanted the record to reflect his patience, his restraint, and his unshakable presence. Around 3:10 p.m., a middle-aged white man in a checkered blazer entered the bank and greeted Susan with an enthusiastic handshake. William watched through the glass as she dropped everything to escort the man personally, offering him coffee and sitting with him in the conference room. She passed by William without acknowledgement, though their eyes briefly met. For a split second, there was something in her gaze. Not guilt, but annoyance, as if his continued presence were an inconvenience she had hoped would resolve itself. She vanished again behind a closed door, and William turned back to his tablet, reading the same sentence 3 times before realizing he hadn't absorbed a single word. Customers now were beginning to glance more frequently in William's direction. One woman, waiting for her son to finish a transaction, furrowed her brow as she looked from William to the front desk, sensing something was off. A man in a suit gave William a polite nod before checking his watch and heading out. The stillness that surrounded William was no longer invisible. It was starting to feel conspicuous. The bank's atmosphere hadn't changed, but the way others in the room perceived it had. It was becoming more evident that this wasn't just a busy afternoon. This was a deliberate delay. At 3:25 p.m., Susan emerged once more and gave William a glance so fleeting it bordered on disdain. "Still here?" she said, her voice low, as if annoyed by his persistence. William looked at her calmly and said, "Yes, I was told you'd need a few minutes. That was over an hour ago." Susan sighed, as though burdened by the idea that she might actually have to meet with him. "I'll try to wrap up soon," she said, then disappeared again, not even pretending to check the status of his documents. William watched her go, her heels clicking on the polished floor, each step an echo of entitlement and casual cruelty. More than once, William considered speaking up, but he knew that drawing attention in the wrong way would shift the narrative. It wouldn't be about a client who waited respectfully. It would become about a black man who raised his voice. He was tired of that double standard. So instead, he sat and waited, not because he had to, but because he had chosen to endure, to observe, to record everything in his mind for the moment when truth would matter more than impressions. And that moment, he felt, was drawing closer. Just as the clock inched toward 3:45 p.m. and the bank's late afternoon lull settled over the lobby, an elegant elderly woman entered through the main doors, her silver hair pinned into a flawless bun and a soft pink cashmere coat draped over her shoulders. Her presence carried the quiet authority of someone used to being respected in spaces like this one. As she stepped forward with measured grace, the receptionist straightened up instinctively and greeted her by name. "Mrs. Hargrove, it's so good to see you." The woman offered a gracious nod in return, clearly familiar to the staff, and made her way toward one of the velvet benches near the waiting area. She moved slowly but deliberately, her eyes scanning the room with a subtle attentiveness. And that's when she noticed him. William, seated in the corner, poised yet isolated. A man dressed as sharply as any executive she'd encountered in her decades of business dealings, but whose presence was being ignored so thoroughly it bordered on intentional humiliation. She studied him for a moment before approaching, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. "Excuse me, dear," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine concern. William looked up, surprised, and smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he replied politely. "Forgive me if I'm intruding, but I've been coming here for years and, well, I couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here for quite a while." William's expression remained kind, but there was an exhaustion behind his eyes he could no longer conceal. "I had a 1 p.m. appointment with the branch manager," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Still waiting to be seen." Mrs. Hargrove blinked, visibly taken aback. "At 1? It's nearly 4. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Surely there's some mistake." William gave a quiet chuckle, more out of habit than humor. "That's what I thought at first." She lowered herself into the seat beside him, ignoring the slight protest in her knees. "And you've just been waiting?" He nodded. "I've spoken to the receptionist, and I did meet Susan briefly. She told me she needed more time to review my documents, and then she just never came back." He didn't add that she had taken several walk-ins and socialized in the meantime. He didn't need to. The woman's face flushed with a quiet indignation that was only magnified by the calm composure of the man beside her. She took a slow breath, steadied herself, and glanced around the lobby. Susan had just exited her office once more, laughing at something one of her junior colleagues had said. Mrs. Hargrove stood without hesitation and strode toward her, her heels echoing sharply on the polished floor. "Susan Mallory," she called, her voice sharper now, commanding enough to cut through the ambient hum of the bank. Susan turned, startled, and upon recognizing the woman, forced a broad smile. "Mrs. Hargrove, what a pleasant surprise. Is there anything I can help you with?" Mrs. Hargrove folded her arms, unimpressed. "Yes, you can explain why that gentleman has been waiting in your lobby for over 2 hours without so much as a follow-up or apology." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Susan's eyes darted to William, then quickly back to the older woman. We've just been extremely busy today, and I've been trying to review his documents and—" "Don't insult me," Mrs. Hargrove cut in, her voice now firm. "I've seen you attend to no less than 5 people since I walked in 20 minutes ago, and I've seen him sitting there since before then. You didn't even offer him water." Susan's smile faltered. "I was going to get to him shortly. After 3 hours?" The older woman scoffed. "If he hadn't looked the way he did, would this have happened?" Susan's face paled. "Excuse me?" she asked defensively. "What exactly are you implying?" Mrs. Hargrove didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "I'm implying that if a white man in a tailored suit had walked into this branch with a business proposal and a scheduled appointment, he wouldn't have been left in the lobby like a vagrant. You don't have to say the words, Susan. You've made it abundantly clear with your actions." A stunned silence spread through the room. Customers nearby had turned to watch, a few exchanging glances, their discomfort turning into unease. Even some of the staff paused in their tasks, unsure how to respond. Susan's cheeks burned crimson, her jaw tightening with a forced smile that no longer concealed her frustration. Meanwhile, William remained seated, dignified but fully aware that the room was shifting. He could feel the tension coalescing around him, not from anything he had said, but because the truth was being spoken on his behalf by someone who had nothing to gain. Mrs. Hargrove turned to him again and said, more loudly this time, "Sir, would you like to sit in my meeting room instead of waiting out here like you've been ignored?" The staff at the front desk visibly shifted, and the receptionist began typing nervously, suddenly eager to find a solution. Susan's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked like she wanted to reclaim control of the narrative, but the room had already moved beyond her. "Actually," Mrs. Hargrove added, "why don't you bring out the branch director? Or better yet, someone from corporate? Because this isn't just about inconvenience. This is about how you treat people based on assumptions." Susan, now visibly shaken, mumbled something about needing to make a phone call and rushed back into her office, slamming the door behind her. The silence left in her wake was deafening. A nearby customer stood and walked over to William, offering a handshake. "I saw how they treated you. It wasn't right," he said quietly. William thanked him, grateful but still composed, the moment too raw for pride. Mrs. Hargrove returned to her seat beside him and exhaled. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," she said, her voice softer now. "But sometimes silence needs to be broken, not by anger, but by witness." William looked at her, genuinely touched. "Thank you," he said simply. "You didn't have to step in." She smiled. "No, I didn't. But I've lived too long to stay quiet when I see dignity being denied." The tension in the bank remained thick after Mrs. Hargrove's public rebuke of Susan's behavior. Conversations had become more hushed, as if people feared the truth might seep into their words. Staff members began exchanging quiet looks, aware that something had ruptured the usual flow of power and protocol. William, still seated with his hands folded, was the eye of the storm, composed, quiet, and somehow commanding the room without uttering a single demand. Susan hadn't returned from her office since she had stormed in, and the front desk had gone eerily still. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, but no one knew what. That answer arrived less than 10 minutes later, announced not by noise but by presence. 3 black luxury SUVs pulled up to the front of the bank, parking in the fire lane as if laws were irrelevant for whoever was inside. Their sleek exterior reflected the afternoon light with a deliberate kind of confidence. The automatic doors parted as 4 sharply dressed individuals stepped through, 2 men and 2 women, all in tailored suits that whispered wealth and authority. They were followed by a sharply groomed assistant carrying a leather binder and a tablet, his pace quick but deferential. The room shifted almost immediately. The receptionist stood up straight. 2 bank tellers looked over and froze mid-conversation. Susan's office door creaked open, and her head popped out like a prairie dog startled by a predator. Her face went pale the moment her eyes met the eyes of the lead figure, Harold Kincaid, the senior chairman of the bank's regional board. Susan stumbled out of her office, adjusting her blouse and smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. She began walking quickly toward them, her smile reappearing like a lifeline. "Mr. Kincaid," she called out, her voice unsteady. "We weren't expecting you until next week." "What a wonderful surprise." Harold didn't slow his stride. "There was a change of schedule," he said curtly, his eyes already scanning the room. When they landed on William, seated calmly with Mrs. Hargrove beside him, they immediately lit up with recognition. "There he is," Harold said with genuine warmth. "William." William stood and approached the group, his handshake firm, his expression serene but sharp with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. The other board members followed Harold's lead, each of them extending a hand, smiling with respect. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person," one of the women said. "Your reputation precedes you." William nodded humbly, exchanging greetings with each of them. Susan stood frozen, her mouth slightly ajar, watching as the man she had intentionally belittled and ignored was being welcomed like royalty. Her eyes flicked back and forth between them, her mind scrambling to connect the dots. Harold placed a hand on William's shoulder and turned to the bank staff, who were now visibly on edge. "Everyone, I'd like to formally introduce Mr. William Langston," he announced. "He's our newest advisory board member and the strategic partner responsible for overseeing diversity expansion and equity policy in our upcoming regional initiatives." The silence that followed was deafening. Susan's jaw clenched, the blood draining from her face entirely. The same man she had left to sit unattended for hours, whose documents she had dismissed without review, was not only a client. He was one of her superiors. Her posture stiffened as if she'd been hit with a wall of ice. "Mr. Langston and I will be touring a few branches over the next quarter," Harold continued. "And this branch was our first stop. We wanted to see how the staff interacts with clients when no one's watching. A sort of informal audit." Every employee within earshot froze. Harold's eyes lingered just long enough on Susan to ensure the implication landed squarely. Susan took a shaky step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't told." "That was the point." One of the board members interrupted, her tone sharp. "This wasn't a photo op. It was a real-world observation." William turned to Susan, his expression still calm but now visibly firm. "Ms. Mallory," he said, addressing her directly for the first time since the ordeal began, "do you have my business incorporation documents on hand? I was told they needed verification." Susan nodded quickly, fumbling with the files on her desk and pulling them out like a magician performing for her life. "Yes, right here," she stammered. I was just getting to them." Harold tilted his head, clearly unimpressed. "You had over 2 hours, Susan. What exactly were you getting to?" Her lips parted, but nothing came out. A low murmur rippled through the customers watching nearby, some shaking their heads, others outright scoffing. The optics were undeniable. A man of color, with more wealth and position than many in the room, had been belittled and ignored until the power dynamic shifted. Now, the reality was visible to everyone. William took the documents without another word, flipping through them as if this were a routine transaction. Then he looked up. "It's always fascinating," he said, addressing no one in particular but ensuring Susan could hear, "how quickly behavior changes when truth walks through the door dressed in a suit." The words struck like thunder, not loud but powerful in their restraint. Mrs. Hargrove, still seated nearby, gave a soft nod of approval, her eyes never leaving Susan's face. The board members exchanged knowing glances, their verdict already written on the wall. Susan took a step back, clutching the edge of the front desk for support. Harold cleared his throat and said, "I think it would be wise to convene a brief meeting in the conference room. Some immediate decisions need to be made." Then, turning to William, he added, "Would you care to join us, Mr. Langston?" William smiled modestly. "Of course." With that, he walked past Susan, his shoulders relaxed, his confidence undiminished. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just stood there, watching the door to the conference room close slowly behind the very man she had tried so hard to dismiss. The conference room, once a symbol of exclusivity and corporate formality, now buzzed with an unspoken charge, a current of accountability that crackled beneath its polished mahogany table and minimalist decor. The board members took their seats around the long table, with Harold gesturing for William to sit beside him at the head. The mood inside was composed, but outside in the lobby, tension remained thick and unmoving. Employees whispered to one another behind screens and copier machines, stealing glances at Susan, who stood stiffly behind the receptionist's desk, pretending to sort paperwork she could barely hold. Her hands shook slightly, betraying the panic she struggled to suppress. Every so often, she'd glance toward the closed conference room door, dreading what words might be spoken behind it and how many of them would have her name attached. Then, without warning, the door to the room opened again, and Harold stepped out, followed closely by William and the rest of the board. They didn't return to the offices in the back or retreat to privacy. Instead, they walked directly into the center of the lobby, where a few remaining clients were waiting, and all bank employees were still at their stations. Harold raised a hand and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, everyone," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that quiets a room without effort. Conversations ceased. Heads turned. Fingers hovered over keyboards. "We'd like to take a moment to address something important." Susan's eyes widened, her face frozen in place. She looked like she might faint. William stood just behind Harold, his expression unreadable, though his eyes swept the room with a sense of quiet ownership, as if reclaiming the space that had tried to deny him earlier. Harold continued, "This afternoon, Mr. William Langston arrived here with a scheduled appointment. He came prepared to discuss a partnership, prepared with documentation, and conducted himself with grace and professionalism. Unfortunately, what he was met with was something else entirely." He paused, letting the silence thicken. What he received was delay, disregard, dismissal. Gasps echoed softly through the room. Even those who had suspected something wrong earlier were visibly stunned to hear it confirmed so plainly and so publicly. Susan's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. "Now," Harold went on, "this is not just a question of poor customer service. This is about bias. This is about prejudice masquerading as professionalism. And this, in our organization, is unacceptable." He turned toward William, who stepped forward with poise, his hands clasped in front of him. "When I first entered this bank today," William began, his voice composed but resonant, "I did so as a client. I came here not to demand privilege, but to request service. The same service afforded to everyone who walks through those doors." He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. "Instead, I was ignored, left waiting for nearly 3 hours. I was spoken to with condescension. I was looked through rather than looked at. And the irony is, none of this would have changed had the board not walked in." Now the room was utterly silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush itself. "That is the problem," William said. "That's why I accepted the board position. Because equity is not something that trickles down from policy memos. It is revealed or exposed. In moments like these, when no one thinks they're being watched." Susan's face had turned an impossible shade of red, and her eyes darted between the floor and the faces around her, hoping for a lifeline that wasn't coming. Harold took over again. "Effective immediately, we are launching a review of how clients are engaged and evaluated at every branch. But here, today, at this branch, action must be taken now." The regional director, a composed woman in a charcoal gray pantsuit, stepped forward and said, "Ms. Mallory, you are being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Please return your access badge and step away from client areas." Susan looked up as if she hadn't fully processed the words. "Wait, what?" she whispered. "You can't be serious?" Her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief, but no one moved to defend her. Her co-workers, though shocked, knew better than to interfere. The receptionist swallowed hard and looked down at her desk. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, while others looked on with quiet approval. Mrs. Hargrove, still seated nearby, gave a slow, satisfied nod and whispered to no one in particular. "Good." Susan, now trembling, reached into her blazer pocket, removed her badge, and placed it on the desk with shaking fingers. Her eyes met William's for the briefest of moments. There was no hatred in his gaze, no cruelty, just disappointment, and in many ways that was worse. She turned and walked out of the building slowly, each step echoing in the marble chamber that just hours earlier had been her domain. Harold stepped closer to William and said, "You handled this with more grace than most would have. Thank you." William nodded silently, but inside, the moment carried weight far beyond policy. It was vindication not just for him, but for every professional who'd ever been overlooked, every person of color dismissed before a word was spoken, every quiet dignity trampled by assumption. As the staff returned to their duties, now under the watchful eyes of leadership, William stood near the entrance, his shoulders relaxed, the balance finally restored, not through force, but through truth revealed in daylight. As the doors slowly closed behind Susan, the silence that lingered in the bank was profound, not empty, but full of meaning. It was the kind of silence that follows truth laid bare, a silence that allowed dignity, long denied, to finally stretch itself across the room. William remained near the center of the lobby, not basking in victory, but standing in quiet reflection. He hadn't sought retribution. He hadn't come to make a scene or expose anyone. All he had wanted was to be treated with respect, to conduct his business like any other professional. But in the end, it was his restraint, his refusal to match disrespect with anger, that had spoken the loudest. The board members, still standing nearby, were engaged in low conversation about next steps for the branch, but all of them occasionally glanced in William's direction, their expressions marked with genuine admiration. The regional director approached him again, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Langston, thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like today. Not just in title, but in temperament." William nodded. "Sometimes you don't get to choose the moment, but you can choose how you carry yourself in it." She smiled softly and extended her hand. "Your presence here today did more than any training module we could design. This branch, and likely many others, will never operate the same again." William shook her hand, then turned to acknowledge the other board members, offering a few brief words before excusing himself to return to the seat he had occupied earlier that afternoon. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, returning not out of defeat, but to reclaim the space where he had been minimized, now elevated by truth. Mrs. Hargrove joined him again, this time sitting without a word, only offering a small smile that said everything. William leaned over slightly and said, "You didn't have to say anything earlier, but I'm very glad you did." She patted his hand. "Sometimes silence is complicity, dear. I've lived long enough to know that not saying something is how things stay broken." Around them, the bank gradually resumed its rhythm, though it was clear things would never truly go back to how they were just hours ago. The atmosphere had changed. Every conversation carried more weight. Every glance between staff members seemed more self-aware, more cautious, as if they'd been snapped awake from the slumber of unconscious bias. And while there was discomfort in that realization, there was also growth. A few customers approached William before he left, shaking his hand, thanking him for how he handled everything. Some of them were black, others white or Latino, but they all recognized something universal in his poise, the grace of someone who refused to be reduced. One man, a young father holding the hand of his daughter, said, "I hope my little girl grows up to carry herself like you just did." William smiled warmly, kneeling down to greet the child with a quiet hello before standing and placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "She's already off to a good start." With each encounter, William's calm rippled outward, shifting the day's events from a moment of shame to a teachable one. When he finally gathered his belongings and walked toward the exit, the staff rose instinctively to acknowledge him, a gesture that hadn't occurred to them when he first arrived. But this time, it wasn't performative. It was rooted in something real, something earned through recognition, not fear. As he approached the door, Harold stepped beside him and said, "You know, you could have embarrassed her. You could have exploded in that lobby and no one would have blamed you." William paused at the threshold, looking out at the street bathed in late afternoon light. "That's not what power is," he said. "Power is when you know who you are, even when someone else tries to convince you that you're less." Harold nodded slowly. The board couldn't have made a better choice. William offered a firm handshake, then exited the bank with the same steady stride he had entered with. But now every eye watched him go, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Outside, a soft breeze rustled the trees lining the avenue, and for the first time all day, William felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He had come to open an account. Instead, he had opened eyes. Justice hadn't come in the form of shouting or spectacle. It had arrived wrapped in self-control, carried by presence, and sealed by truth. As he stepped into his car and closed the door behind him, he exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in completion. Dignity, denied for a moment, had returned tenfold.